Hello again. Glad you joined us for this last segment in Daniel. I said last segment in Daniel. Last segment in the narrative section of Daniel. This is chapter 6. Daniel chapter 6. We're in the last section, the last chapter of the narrative section of Daniel. When we get into chapters 7 and following, which will be our next segment, getting into chapter 7, we're going to be in apocalyptic literature. This is some thorny stuff, and we'll be spending some more time there dicing out some of this, sorting out some of this other material. This is chapter 6, and we said enough about this last time, so I won't belabor the point. But 5, 30, and 31 is actually connected into the start of chapter 6. It's connected. Everybody agrees it's connected. So as you take a look at chapter 6, it says it seemed good to Darius, same one from chapter 5 and verse 31. Seemed good to Darius to appoint 120 satraps over the kingdom, that they would be in charge over the whole kingdom, and over them 3 commissioners, of whom Daniel was one, that these satraps might be accountable to them, and that the king might not suffer loss. Then this Daniel began distinguishing himself among the commissioners and satraps, because he possessed an extraordinary spirit, and the king planned to appoint him over the entire kingdom. This Daniel can't help but be successful. He is consistently shorted by the people in the political arena, and he continues to come right back to the top. He did with Nebuchadnezzar, did with Belshazzar, and here he is with Darius. Then it says in verse 4, 6:4, Then the commissioners and satraps began trying to find a ground of accusation against Daniel in regard to government affairs, but they could find no ground of accusation or evidence of corruption, inasmuch as he was faithful, and no negligence or corruption was to be found in him. Josephus said something like Daniel was above temptation and bribery. So this is 6:5. These men said, We will not find any ground of accusation against this Daniel unless we find it against him with regard to the law of his God. We're going to have to get him to violate something. Something's got to give, they're thinking. And so in 6 and verse 6, then these commissioners and satraps came by agreement to the king and spoke to him as follows. King Darius, live forever. All the commissioners of the kingdom, the prefects, satraps, high officials, governors have consulted together that the king should establish a statute and enforce an injunction that anyone who makes a petition to any god or man besides you, O king, for 30 days shall be cast into the lion's den. Some of the skeptics, the liberal critical scholars, have said that putting folks in the lion's den as execution or something of the sort was completely out of this culture. Well, that's not exactly true. Robert Dick Wilson, again, the professor of Old Testament at Princeton Theological, documents a number of cases where people like Tiglath-Pileser or Ashur-Narsipal, they kept lions on hand. This would not be out of place by any means. And the scholars who say this sort of thing in order to try to make Daniel a fictitious narrative just simply need to do their homework. This is 6:8. Now, O king, establish the injunction and sign the document so that it may not be changed according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, which may not be revoked. You recognize in Esther 1, Esther 8, that the law of the Medes and the Persians couldn't be pulled back. And so in that case even, the Persian king has to write a new law over rather than to revoke the old one. And you can see all of those details in the book of Esther. This is verse 9. Darius signed the injunction. And it says in verse 10, when Daniel knew that the document was signed, well, what would you do? Would you go to your house and just decide, well, I guess I'm done praying for the 30 days? Daniel entered his house. Now in his roof chamber he had his windows open toward Jerusalem. And he continued kneeling on his knees 3 times a day, praying and giving thanks before his God, as he had been doing previously. As he had been doing previously. He didn't do it out of spite, where the command came not to pray, and then he said, well, I guess I'll show them, and now I'll start opening my windows even. No, this is how he had done. So it wasn't anything in spite of the government's order. It was something that he had already been doing, and he was going to be faithful to his God. Now this is Psalm 55:17. This is Psalm 55:17. It says, evening and morning and at noon I will complain and murmur, and he will hear my voice. The psalmist in 55:17 said that he prayed 3 times a day. This is Daniel's practice as well. So it says in verse 11, Daniel 6:11, these men came by agreement and found Daniel making petition and supplication before his God. Then they approached and spoke before the king about the king's injunction. Did you not sign an injunction that any man who makes a petition to any god or man besides you, O king, for 30 days is to be cast into the lion's den? And the king replied, the statement is true according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, which may not be revoked. And now they've got him. They had flattered him early on. They had been the ones responsible. Now all of a sudden the king's the one responsible. And so in 6:13, they answered and spoke before the king. Daniel, who is one of the exiles from Judah, pays no attention to you, O king, or to the injunction which you signed. Early on it was their idea. They were in on it. Now they've got Daniel trapped and they say, you did this, king. You signed it. But he keeps making his petition 3 times a day. Then, verse 14, as soon as the king heard this statement, he was deeply distressed, set his mind on delivering Daniel, and even until sunset he kept exerting himself to rescue him. We'll have to read the rest of the narrative, but I keep reading these folks who say that Darius wasn't some kind of noble fellow for God. Look, I don't know that Darius was actually a God-fearer in the best of sense, in the best of the sense. I don't know that he was a monotheist like Daniel. I mean, he makes some kinds of statements here. It's tough to say if he actually means them or not. I just don't know. But in chapter 6, it does say this. This isn't the king and his remark about himself. This is Daniel's remark. This is the narrator's remark. As soon as the king heard the statement, verse 14, he was distressed. He set his mind on delivering Daniel. Even until sunset, he kept exerting himself to rescue him. These people who talk about Darius as some kind of goon, I think we're selling him short. This is 6:15. These men came by agreement to the king and said to the king, recognize, O king, it's a law of the Medes and the Persians that no injunction or statute which the king establishes may be changed. It's almost as if they keep pouring the salt in the wound. They say, you've done this. And remember, the law of the Medes and the Persians can't be changed. We've got to kill Daniel. And you can only imagine the political agenda that these fellows have and why they want Daniel out of the limelight. This is chapter 6 and verse 16. It says, then the king gave orders, and Daniel was brought in and cast into the lion's den. The king spoke and said to Daniel, your God, whom you constantly serve, will himself deliver you. Did he really believe that? Tough to say. Maybe it's a last-ditch effort. Maybe it's all he's got now. Well, hopefully Daniel's God can actually do something, but maybe he does doubt. Don't know. But the text does still say in 6:14 he was trying his best to get Daniel out of the pit. And that's noble indeed. So in verse 17, a stone was brought, laid over the mouth of the den. The king sealed it with his own signet ring and with the signet rings of his nobles, so that nothing would be changed in regard to Daniel. And then the king went off to his palace, spent the night fasting. I mean, how do you think of Darius as a goon at this point? The guy doesn't eat food. No entertainment was brought before him. His sleep fled from him. This doesn't happen to people who don't feel guilt, you see. He's feeling remorse. He's feeling the pain. And it says in verse 19, the king arose at dawn at the break of day and went into haste into the lion's den. Why did he do that if he didn't have some kind of faith? Why even go check? Why not just assume Daniel's surely a goner? But in verse 20, he came near to the den to Daniel, and he cried out with a troubled voice. And the king spoke and said to Daniel, Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you constantly serve, been able to deliver you from the lions? And Daniel spoke to the king, O king, live forever. And then this is Daniel's remark, and maybe it helps us with chapter 3 and the fourth figure in the furnace. Daniel says, my God sent his angel, shut the lions' mouths, and they've not harmed me. We read Hebrews chapter 11, verses 32 through 34, back when we were in chapter 3 of Daniel. Hebrews 11, 32 through 34 says that the writer didn't have time to tell us about all those other folks of Jephthah and Barak and David, but it says this. It says, and there were some who walked through fire, and there were some who stopped the mouths of lions. Wonder if he's got Daniel in view. As far as the biblical literature is concerned, he's the only one. Daniel's in view. This is verse 22. God sent his angel, shut the lion's mouth, they've not harmed me. Daniel says, inasmuch as I was found innocent before him, and also toward you, O king, I've committed no crime. No crime. And so in 23, then the king was very pleased and gave orders for Daniel to be taken up out of the den. Daniel was taken out of the den, no injury whatever was found on him, because he trusted in his God. We have another example here of faith. We have another example of faith. And so in 6:24, the king gave orders, and they brought those men who had maliciously accused Daniel, and they cast them, their children, their wives, into the lion's den, and they had not reached the bottom of the den before the lions overpowered them and crushed all their bones. Maybe it was only Daniel's accusers. I don't know if it's the whole 120 satraps, but somebody gets thrown back into the den. And then Darius the king wrote to all the peoples, nations, and men of every language who were living in all the land, May your peace abound. Now catch this in 626. Darius makes a decree in all the dominion of his kingdom. Men are to fear and tremble before the God of Daniel. He's the living God, enduring forever. His kingdom is one which will not be destroyed. His dominion will be forever. He delivers and rescues and performs signs and wonders in heaven and on earth, who has also delivered Daniel from the power of the lions. Definitely sounds good. Definitely sounds like Darius has turned into something of a God-fearer. Tough to say. It's tough to say. The text just doesn't give us enough information to know exactly what's going on, but he does give the decree saying this sort of thing in a noble way about God. And then 628 brings the whole narrative section to a close. Daniel enjoyed success in the reign of Darius and in the reign of Cyrus the Persian. Some have tried to argue, let's just hit this real quick and then we'll bring it all to a close. Some have tried to argue that Cyrus, because of this, is another name for Darius and vice versa. Darius is another name for Cyrus. I don't know that that's quite warranted. We've seen enough of this co-regency in the text. 628 might have something like that in view. I think that Darius is a Mede, Cyrus is a Persian. They are two different ethnicities. Darius's father is a Ahasuerus. Maybe if we look back into the secular literature, we can find out something about Cyrus's parents. I think this is extremely questionable to say that Cyrus is Darius for a number of reasons. It looks like to me in chapter 9:1, we have, the first year of Darius? 9:1 is the first year of Darius. Chapter 10, verse 1 is the third year of Cyrus. That can't be true if 9 through 12 is one block. I think it is one block. I think they're two different individuals. I think Darius is a co-regent to Cyrus, probably Gubaru of the Nabonidus Chronicle. And it looks like to me his first year, 536, would be the third year of Cyrus, 536. Cyrus starts reigning in 539. Darius takes some kind of provincial throne, co-regent throne, in 536. Cyrus in 539 begins. Darius begins in 536, it looks like to me. That brings us to the close of the narrative section of the book of Daniel. Wait till we get into chapter 7, and we're going to start dealing with what's called apocalyptic literature. You'll notice how different it is from ordinary literature styles, and we'll start talking about Daniel's visions and what exactly he has in store. If you've got other questions about that, especially as we get into these more thorny chapters, if you've got questions or comments about that, shoot me an email, or if you want to develop a lot of this further, the commentary is far more expansive on some of this than I'll be even in the upcoming videos. Daniel chapters 7 through 12 are thorny, and I probably outline here in the book the view we should take even better than I'll do in the upcoming videos. Hopefully this has richly blessed you in your study of the book of Daniel. Until next time, thanks for joining.